The rangemaster stood at the firing line with his arms crossed over his chest and laughed loud enough that 3 shooters 2 benches down turned to look. "Sir, I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but that rifle you brought is a museum piece. Pre-war Springfields don't group under 6 inches at 600 yards. They just don't. The metallurgy's tired, the barrels are shot out, and half the time the bedding's cracked and nobody even knows it. You want to shoot this match, that's fine. We'll score you like everybody else, but I'd hate for you to drive home feeling bad about a rifle that was built before your daddy was born." He gestured at the battered walnut stock cradled in the old man's arms, at the dull-blued steel and the worn leather sling and the scope mount that looked like it had been hand-fitted in a machine shop before colour television. "Tell you what, if you put 5 rounds inside 6 inches at 600 today, I'll buy every man on this firing line lunch. Deal?" The old veteran in the faded khaki shirt didn't smile and didn't frown. He just looked down at the 1903 Springfield in his hands and then back up at the rangemaster, and he said, very quietly, "Son, I'll hold you to that. If you believe that some rifles and some men earn their reputations the hard way and don't owe anybody an explanation, type the word honour in the comments before we go any further, because you are about to watch a rangemaster learn a lesson that will follow him for the rest of his life." His name was Walter Pruitt, and at 80 years old he moved across the gravel parking lot of the Red Mesa Long Range Shooting Club, the way a man moves who has been on his feet for 60 years and does not intend to sit down yet. He was tall once, still tall though the years had bent him an inch or 2 at the shoulders, and he wore a pair of khaki work trousers with a sharp crease ironed into them by his own hand that morning, a button-down shirt the colour of dry grass, and a pair of leather boots that had been resoled 3 times and polished every Sunday of his adult life. On his head was a wide-brimmed canvas hat that had seen a lot of weather and a little bit of blood. He walked with a slight forward lean and a walnut cane in his left hand, the cane carved with a simple rope pattern around the grip by a man in a veterans' hospital in Colorado Springs in 1974. In his right hand, tucked under his arm the way a carpenter carries his level, was the 1903 Springfield. The rifle was not pretty. The stock had the honest dings and dents of a tool that had been used and not coddled, and the bluing along the barrel had worn down to a smooth grey patina at the places where a man's hands naturally settle on a rifle he has carried a long way. But if you knew what you were looking at, and almost nobody at the Red Mesa Club that morning did, you could see that every working surface of that rifle had been kept with the devotion of a priest keeping an altar. The bolt face was clean. The crown of the muzzle was sharp and unmarred. The leather sling was supple with neat's foot oil, and had the dark sweat stains of 50 summers worked into it. There was a small brass plate let into the underside of the stock just ahead of the trigger guard, but nobody on that range had ever gotten close enough to read what was stamped on it. Walter did not advertise. Walter did not explain. Walter had learned, in a country whose name he still did not like to say out loud, that the men who needed to explain themselves were usually the ones you did not need to worry about. What the cocky young rangemaster in the pressed polo shirt did not know, as he watched Walter Pruitt limp toward the firing line with his old bolt action under his arm, was that the brass plate on the underside of that Springfield had been engraved in 1967 at a small armoury in Da Nang by a Marine gunnery sergeant who had built exactly 11 rifles like it in his entire career, and that the man carrying it had once used a rifle very much like this one to make a shot that was still, 57 years later, classified. The Red Mesa Long Range Shooting Club sat on 200 acres of high desert outside a small town in western New Mexico, and on the first Saturday of every month it hosted an open long-range match that drew shooters from 4 states. The firing line ran along the base of a low ridge, and the target stretched out across a flat, scrubby valley at measured distances all the way back to 1,000 yards. The men who came to shoot there mostly brought modern rifles, custom bolt actions in 6.5 Creedmoor and 300 Norma Magnum, rifles with carbon fibre stocks and adjustable cheek risers and scopes that cost more than Walter's truck. They wore shooting jackets with sponsor patches and ballistic wind meters clipped to their belts, and they carried their rifles in hard cases with combination locks. They were not bad men. Most of them were decent, hard-working fellows who had saved for years to put together the gear they shot with and who loved the sport honestly, but they were the kind of shooters who had come up in an era where precision was something you bought, and they had, most of them, forgotten that there had been a time when precision was something a man built with his own hands at a workbench in the corner of his garage. The rangemaster that morning was a 31-year-old named Cody Vance. Cody had been shooting competitively since he was 16. He had a shelf full of regional trophies at his mother's house in Albuquerque, and he ran the Red Mesa monthly match with the brisk efficiency of a man who enjoyed being in charge of something. He wore wraparound sunglasses pushed up on his forehead, a white polo shirt with the club logo, and the kind of tactical cargo pants that have more pockets than a man could fill in a year. He was not a cruel person, but he had the particular blindness that comes to young men who have never been outshot by somebody they had written off, and when he had seen Walter Pruitt unload a battered Springfield from the passenger seat of an old Ford F-150 that morning, he had made the same mistake that Tyler Brennan had made in a strip mall in Beaumont 7 months earlier, though he did not know that story and never would. He had decided, before the old man had even finished walking to the registration table, that he knew exactly how this was going to go. And 3 states away, at a small ranch house outside Flagstaff, Arizona, a retired Marine Corps sergeant major who had not seen Walter Pruitt in 41 years was about to get a phone call that would put him in his truck inside of 10 minutes, with a folder under his arm that had been sitting locked in a gun safe since 1983. Walter signed the registration sheet in the same careful block letters he used for everything he wrote, paid his $20 match fee in cash, and walked slowly down the firing line toward bench number 7. The bench assignments were random, but Cody Vance had a habit of putting the older shooters closer to the tower so he could keep an eye on them, and he had written Walter's name down on the 7th slot without thinking much about it. Walter set his rifle case, a soft canvas scabbard with a drawstring top, the kind of case a farmer might use to carry a rifle out to a pasture, on the bench, and began to unpack with the slow, deliberate movements of a man who had been setting up shooting positions before most of the other men on the line had been born. He laid out a folded shooting mat Elena had sewn for him out of an old army blanket in 1978. He set down a small leather pouch containing 5 rounds of ammunition that he had loaded himself the night before at the bench in his garage. Each cartridge weighed on a balance beam scale accurate to 1/10 of a grain, each case trimmed and chamfered by hand, each bullet seated to a depth he had worked out over 400 rounds of load development conducted across the summer of 2019. He unclipped the leather sling from the rifle's front swivel, ran it through his left arm in the loop sling configuration the Marine Corps had taught him in 1962 at Camp Pendleton, and cinched it down until the tension was exactly right. He did all of this without looking up, without speaking, without paying any attention to the 3 shooters at the next bench who had stopped their own setup to watch him. It was when he finally lifted the rifle to inspect the bore one last time that Cody Vance came walking down the line, with his clipboard under his arm and his sunglasses pushed up on his forehead and his voice set to the pitch of friendly condescension that he used with shooters he had decided in advance were not going to trouble the scoreboard. "Morning, sir. Walter, is it? I'm Cody. I'm running the match today. That is a heck of a rifle you've brought with you. Is that an original 03 or one of the 03A3s? Original, Walter said. He did not look up from the bore. 1941 rebuild of a 1918 receiver. Barrels a Krieger one fitted in 78. Cody blinked. That was not the answer he had expected. A Krieger barrel in a 1903 Springfield was not a museum piece. It was a deliberate choice made by a man who knew what he was doing. But Cody had already committed to the story he was telling himself about the old man at bench 7, and he was not yet ready to let a stray fact get in the way of it. He pressed on with the same easy smile. "Well, sir, I got to be honest with you. I've seen a lot of old war horses come through here over the years, and most of the time the boys who bring them are just here for the fun of it, which is great, which is what this sport is all about. But I want to make sure you understand how the scoring works today. We're shooting out to 600 yards for the main string, and the scoring zone on the target is a 6-inch circle. Anything outside the 6-inch circle counts as a miss. So if you're just here to make noise and have a good time, that's wonderful. We love having you. But if you're expecting to compete against the fellas with the Creedmoors, I want you to know, going in, that pre-war rifles just don't hold groups like the modern stuff. Metallurgy's tired, barrels are usually shot out even when they look good, and this barrel has 1,100 rounds through it, Walter said, still without looking up. I cleaned it this morning. The throat is fine. Cody paused again. 1,100 rounds was nothing for a Krieger. That was a barrel with decades of life left in it, in the hands of a man who had apparently been counting every round down to the unit. The 3 shooters at the next bench were openly watching now. One of them, an older man in a faded Marine Corps ball cap who had been quietly setting up a heavy-barreled custom rifle in 6.5 PRC, had gone very still and was watching Walter's hands the way a man watches a master craftsman at a workbench. But Cody Vance still had his smile, and he still had his story, and he still had an audience of the 3 shooters behind him and half the firing line beyond that. So he did the thing that young men do when a moment is slipping away from them and they do not yet know how to let it go. He laughed. He laughed, and he said the words that he would remember word for the rest of his life. "Sir, I'll tell you what. If you put 5 rounds inside 6 inches at 600 yards today with that rifle, I will personally buy lunch for every shooter on this firing line. Deal?" And Walter Pruitt finally looked up from the bore of his rifle, and he looked Cody Vance directly in the eyes for the first time. And what Cody saw in those eyes made the smile slide off his face by about half a degree without his even knowing it had moved. "Son," Walter said, quietly enough that only Cody and the Marine at the next bench could hear him, "I'll hold you to that." The old Marine in the ball cap at the next bench set down the bolt he had been inspecting and reached into his pocket for his phone, and he stepped a few paces back from the firing line, and he made a call. Walter eased himself down onto the shooting mat with the patience of a man who knew that the first 30 seconds of a prone position determined the next 3 minutes of shooting. He set his cane carefully to the side. He worked his left elbow into the dirt at the exact angle his old distinguished rifleman coach had beaten into him in 1963 at Camp Perry. He settled the rifle's forend into the palm of his left hand, the sling tight across the back of his triceps, and he drew his first full breath of the position and let it out slowly and felt the crosshairs of the old Unertal 8 power scope settle onto the distant target and stop moving. The target was a black diamond on a white backer 600 yards across the valley, and through the scope it looked the size of a pencil eraser held at arm's length. Walter closed his eyes for a moment. He thought about his breathing. He thought about the wind, which was coming from his 8 o'clock at maybe 4 miles an hour, a wind he had been reading off the dry grass at the 100-yard line ever since he had stepped out of his truck. He thought about the 47 grains of IMR 4895 powder behind the 173 grain match bullet in each of the 5 rounds in his leather pouch, and about the 0.002 of an inch of bullet jump he had dialed in across 4 months of load development, and about the 1/10 of a mil of elevation correction he had written down on a small white index card, paper-clipped to the inside of his hat band that morning after reading the temperature off a thermometer hanging on his porch. He thought, for just a fraction of a second, about a night in 1968 in a country whose name he still did not like to say, and about a man named Chief Warrant Officer Bennett who had stood behind him at a different firing line a long time ago and said the same words he now said to himself every time he settled behind a rifle. Trust the data. Trust the rifle. Trust the breath. He opened his eyes. He let half his breath out. He took up the slack in the 2-stage trigger that he had stoned by hand in 1981 to break cleanly at 2 pounds 6 ounces, and he squeezed. The Springfield's report rolled across the valley and came back twice off the ridges, and the old rifle kicked solidly against Walter's shoulder the way a well-bedded full-power 30-06 was supposed to kick, and Walter worked the bolt with the smooth, practiced motion of a man who had worked that exact bolt more times than he had kissed his own wife, and the brass arced out of the action and fell onto the mat beside his right elbow. He settled back into the position. 4 rounds to go. Cody Vance was standing in the tower behind the firing line with his spotting scope trained on Walter's target. He had not expected to care what came up on that target. But when the first bullet hole appeared, a small clean dot a 1/4 inch above and a hair to the right of the centre of the 6-inch scoring ring, Cody's mouth, which had been opened slightly to say something to the timer officer beside him, closed without saying it. He leaned forward into the spotting scope. He watched the second shot. The second hole appeared directly alongside the first, so close that it was almost touching, and Cody's hand on the focus ring of the spotting scope tightened involuntarily. The third shot went into the same hole cluster, expanding it slightly. The fourth shot did the same. Cody was not laughing anymore. The timer officer beside him, a woman in her 50s named Marlene, who had been running timers at long-range matches in New Mexico for 20 years, looked up from her stopwatch and said softly, "Cody, are those all going in the same hole?" Cody did not answer. He was watching the 5th and final shot form up in the old man's position on the mat, watching the way Walter's shoulders settled and his breathing slowed and his finger took up the slack, and then the rifle spoke one last time and a 5th hole appeared on the distant target, and Cody Vance, rangemaster of the Red Mesa Long Range Shooting Club, said the word that would have cost him $5 in the swear jar at his mother's house when he was 12 years old. He said it very quietly. He said it again. Down on the firing line, Walter Pruitt worked the bolt one last time, caught the empty brass in his palm as it ejected, set the rifle down gently on the mat, and lay still for a few seconds with his eyes closed. Then he opened them, turned his head, and called up toward the tower in the same quiet voice he had used since arriving. "Rangemaster, 5 rounds fired, rifle clear. Request permission to send a spotter to pull the target." It took Cody Vance 3 tries to key the microphone on the tower's public address system. When his voice finally came out of the speakers along the firing line, every shooter on the line had already stopped what they were doing and turned to look toward bench 7. "Permission granted. Cease fire on the line. Cease fire on the line. All shooters make your rifles safe and step back from the benches. We're going to walk the 600-yard target." There is a thing that happens sometimes on a long-range firing line, a thing that old competitive shooters know about and talk about in lowered voices when they are among their own kind. It is the moment when an entire line of men with rifles recognizes all at once that something rare has just happened in their presence. It is a kind of silence that settles over a range the way silence settles over a church during the moment just before a wedding begins. That silence fell on the Red Mesa Long Range Shooting Club as the spotter's pickup truck bounced across the valley floor toward the 600-yard target berm, and it deepened as the truck stopped, and the spotter got out, and the spotter walked up to Walter Pruitt's target, and the spotter stood there for a long moment looking at it without moving. And then the spotter reached up and took the target down off the frame, and he held it up in front of the truck's headlights so that the whole pattern caught the morning light, and even from 600 yards away, through the spotting scopes on the firing line, every man on that range could see that there was essentially one hole in that target. One ragged hole, slightly elongated, about the diameter of a dime, sitting almost dead center in the 6-inch scoring ring. The spotter keyed his handheld radio. His voice came out of the tower speakers thin and a little awestruck. "Tower, spotter at 600. I have Pruitt's target in hand. 5 shots, 1 group. Group measures." There was a pause while the spotter held the target up and used a small caliper he had pulled from his belt. "Group measures 7/8 of an inch, center to center, outside to outside about 1 1/8 inches. All 5 shots inside a 1 1/4 inch circle. Repeat, 1 1/4 inches at 600 yards. Tower, this is the tightest group I have ever pulled off that berm." The firing line did not cheer. It was too stunned to cheer. Instead, one by one, the shooters on the line turned slowly toward bench 7, and toward the old man in the faded khaki shirt who was now sitting up on his shooting mat and carefully unsnapping the leather sling from his left arm. The old Marine in the ball cap at bench 8 took his cap off and held it against his chest. A younger shooter, 4 benches down, a man in his 40s who ran a precision rifle blog out of Santa Fe, had set down his phone and was staring at Walter with his mouth slightly open. And Cody Vance was no longer in the tower. Cody Vance was walking down the wooden steps of the tower toward the firing line with his clipboard hanging forgotten at his side, and his face the colour of the dry grass in the valley below. It was at that exact moment that a dark green pickup truck pulled into the gravel parking lot of the Red Mesa Long Range Shooting Club and came to a stop at the edge of the lot, and the door opened and a man in his mid-70s stepped out. He was not tall, but he carried himself like a man who had been taller once, and had lost nothing essential in the shrinking. He wore jeans and a short-sleeved button-down shirt and a pair of aviator sunglasses, and in his left hand he carried a manila folder that was thick with age. He walked across the parking lot and up to the edge of the firing line without hurrying. He did not look at Cody Vance. He did not look at the other shooters. He walked directly to bench 7, and he stopped about 6 feet from Walter Pruitt, and he came to attention, and he rendered a salute that was not the salute of a civilian remembering how to do it, but the salute of a man who had rendered 10,000 of them in his career and had not forgotten how. "Gunnery Sergeant Pruitt," the man said. His voice carried along the firing line without his raising it. "Sergeant Major Ramon de la Cruz, United States Marine Corps, retired. Permission to approach the bench, Gunny." Walter Pruitt looked up from the shooting mat. Something moved behind his eyes, and for the first time that morning a small quiet smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Ramon," he said, "how did you find me?" "Tony Castellano at bench 8 called me 45 minutes ago. Said there was an old Marine at Red Mesa with a Bennett-built 03 who was about to show the Rangemaster something. I was in my truck in 10 minutes. I've been waiting to have a conversation with you for 41 years, Gunny, and I was not going to miss it by being polite." He turned then, and he looked directly at Cody Vance, who had stopped about 4 feet from Walter's bench and was standing there with his clipboard at his side, and Sergeant Major Delacruz's face did not harden exactly, but it did something quieter and more final than hardening. "Son, is your name Cody Vance?" "Yes, sir." "I understand you made a bet with this man about 6 inches at 600 yards. Cody swallowed. "Yes, sir." "Do you know who this man is, son?" "No." "Sir, I don't." Sergeant Major Delacruz nodded slowly, the way a schoolteacher nods when a student has finally admitted what the teacher already knew. Then he opened the manila folder in his left hand. "This man is Gunnery Sergeant Walter J. Pruitt, United States Marine Corps, retired. He enlisted in 1962. He completed Scout Sniper School at Camp Pendleton in 1966 at the top of his class. He served 3 tours in the Republic of Vietnam between 1966 and 1970. During his second tour, in November of 1968, he was assigned to a joint operation that I am not going to describe in any detail here because parts of it are still classified. I can tell you that on a hillside outside a village I'm not going to name, Gunnery Sergeant Pruitt made a shot that saved the lives of 11 men, including a young corporal named Ramon de la Cruz, who was 20 years old at the time, and who had given up on the idea that anybody was coming for him. The shot was taken with a rifle very much like the one on the mat in front of you. It was built by a Marine Gunnery Sergeant Armourer named Clarence Bennett in a Quonset hut in Da Nang, and there were only 11 of them ever made, and Gunny Pruitt has been shooting the same rifle Bennett built for him for 57 years. Son, the brass plate on the underside of that stock has Clarence Bennett's initials on it and a date. Have you looked at it? No, sir. No, of course you haven't, because you didn't look at any of it. You looked at an old man with a cane and an old rifle with honest wear on it, and you decided you knew what you were looking at, and you were wrong about every single part of that decision. Now, son, I am not here to humiliate you. Gunny Pruitt would not want that, and I would not do it in his presence. But I am going to tell you something, and I want you to hear it. You are standing on a firing line in front of a man who has forgotten more about long-range shooting than the best shooter at this match will ever know. He did not come here this morning to prove anything to you. He came here because old men who have loved rifles their whole lives still love rifles when they are old, and a long-range match on a Saturday morning is one of the few pleasures the years have not been able to take from him. You very nearly ruined that pleasure for him with your mouth, and the only reason it was not ruined is because the gunny is a better man than you gave him credit for, and because an old Marine at the next bench recognized a rifle and made a phone call. Do you understand me, son?" Cody Vance's eyes were wet now. He nodded. "Yes, Sergeant Major, I understand." "Look at him when you answer." Cody turned toward Walter. "Gunny Pruitt, I am so sorry. I was completely out of line. I didn't know a thing about what I was looking at, and I ran my mouth anyway, and I am sorry, sir. I'm really deeply sorry." Walter looked at the young man for a long quiet moment, and then, in the same low, steady voice he had used since arriving that morning, he said, "Son, stand up straight. Nobody died. You're going to be all right." He reached out with one weathered hand and put it on Cody's forearm. "I was a rangemaster myself for 14 years at a club in Colorado. I made mistakes too. The trick is to hear the lesson the first time somebody tries to give it to you. You're hearing it. That's most of the work right there." Cody Vance nodded, and a single tear slid down his cheek, and he did not try to wipe it away. Walter did not shoot the rest of the match. He had made his string, and he had made his point, and he had no interest in running up a score at anybody's expense. He sat in a folding chair beside bench 7 for the rest of the morning, with Sergeant Major Delacruz in another folding chair beside him, and the 2 old Marines drank coffee out of a thermos Delacruz had brought in his truck, and they talked quietly about men they had known and places they had been. Tony Castellano, the old Marine in the ball cap from bench 8, joined them around 10 o'clock and sat on an overturned ammo can, and the 3 of them swapped stories in voices pitched low enough that the rest of the firing line had to pretend not to be listening. Shooters came over one at a time throughout the morning to shake Walter's hand. The man from the precision rifle blog in Santa Fe asked very respectfully whether he could take a single photograph of the brass plate on the underside of the stock, and Walter thought about it for a moment, and then turned the rifle over and let him take it. The photograph would go up on the blog 3 days later with a caption that read only, "An 03 Springfield built by Gaius E.T.C.L. Bennett, USMC, Da Nang, 1967. Serial number withheld. Owner prefers to remain unnamed. 5 shots, 600 yards, 7/8 of an inch. Red Mesa, New Mexico. Some rifles keep their secrets. The post was shared 11,000 times in the first week." Walter did not know about any of that, because Walter did not own a computer and had no intention of ever owning one. At noon, Cody Vance walked the entire firing line with a handwritten list on his clipboard, taking lunch orders from every shooter at the match. He drove into town himself in his own truck, and he came back 45 minutes later with 23 paper bags full of sandwiches and chips and cold drinks from a diner on the main street, and he paid for every single bag out of his own wallet, and he handed the first one to Walter Pruitt with both hands and said, "Gunny, lunch, sir." Walter took the bag. He looked up at Cody, and the faintest ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth again. "Thank you, son. Sit down and eat with us." Cody sat. Walter Pruitt drove home to his small house outside Silver City that evening, with the old Springfield back in its canvas scabbard on the passenger seat and the leather pouch of empty brass rattling gently in the glove box. And when he pulled into his driveway, the sun was just going down behind the Mogollon Mountains, and the light was the colour of good whiskey. He carried the rifle into his garage, and he set it on the workbench under the single bare bulb, and he cleaned it the way he cleaned it after every range trip. A patch of hops down the bore, a dry patch, a lightly oiled patch, a wipe down of the action, and the exterior metal with an old cotton rag. He did not rush. He had not rushed anything in 60 years. When he was finished, he set the rifle in its place in the wall rack above the bench, between a Winchester Model 70 his father had left him, and an empty slot where Elena's little .22 used to sit before he had given it to his granddaughter for her 16th birthday. He stood there for a moment looking at the Springfield in the yellow light, and he said, quietly enough that nobody but the rifle could hear him, "Good work today, old girl. Clarence would be proud." In the weeks that followed, Sergeant Major Delacruz drove up from Flagstaff twice a month to visit, and the two of them sat on Walter's porch in the evening and watched the light change over the mountains and did not always need to speak. Cody Vance sent Walter a handwritten letter about a month after the match, on good stationery, in careful cursive, in which he thanked the old gunny for his patience and his kindness, and asked whether he might, if it was not too much to ask, drive up to Silver City some day and sit with Walter at his workbench for an afternoon and learn some of the things about long-range shooting that a young man could only learn from an old one. Walter wrote back a short reply on the back of an index card. It said, "Come on up any Saturday. Bring your rifle. Bring your ears. The coffee's on me." Cody came the following Saturday, and he came the Saturday after that, and he came most Saturdays for the rest of the year. And he learned things from Walter Pruitt at that workbench that he had not known existed to be learned, and his own groups at 600 yards shrank by almost half over the course of the winter. And on a Tuesday morning in early spring, at the Red Mesa Long Range Shooting Club, a young shooter Cody Vance had never met before showed up at the registration table with a battered old Enfield bolt action under his arm and a look on his face that said he expected to be laughed at. Cody Vance took the man's $20. He walked him down the line to his assigned bench. He helped him set up his shooting mat. He asked the man, politely and with genuine interest, about the history of his rifle and about the loads he had worked up for it. And then, before he walked back to the tower, Cody Vance put his hand on the young shooter's shoulder and said something that he had heard an old gunnery sergeant say to him on a porch in Silver City one Saturday afternoon in November. "Son, trust your data, trust your rifle, trust your breath, and don't let anybody on this line make you feel small for bringing an honest rifle to an honest match, including me, especially me. You shoot the best you can and I'll score you fair. Good luck, brother." The young shooter nodded, and his hands on the rifle steadied, and Cody Vance walked back up to the tower to start the match. If this story moved you, do old Walter Pruitt the one kindness he would ever ask of any of us. The next time you see an older man at a range or a hardware store or a diner counter, set your assumptions down before you set your coffee down, and listen to him like he has something to teach you. Because 9 times out of 10, he does. These stories of forgotten marksmen and quiet veterans are the reason this channel exists, and we can only keep telling them with your help. If you believe that a well-loved rifle and a steady hand and 60 years of patience still belong on any firing line in this country, hit that subscribe button right now and share this video with somebody who grew up smelling hoppers number 9 in his father's garage. Walter Pruitt is still out there. So are men like him. And as long as we remember to listen, their shots will keep finding their targets. Thank you for watching.